This is the SFFaudio podcast. I'm Scott.
I'm Jesse.
So what's going on this week, Jesse?
We're gonna have
Anything good?
We're gonna have an interview, I hope. And what about with you? What's going on?
All right. Boy, not a lot new this week. Busy week. Didn't get enough listening done, but I did finish The Little Book, and I have a review almost in. We talked about that last week.
Nice.
The Little Book by Selden Edwards.
And what's the verdict?
It was good. It was good. Like I said last week, the science fiction or the genre parts of it are not all that important, so it's more of a mainstream novel.
Mm-hmm.
So, which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, of course. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But,
I think there is something wrong with that,
that's what I expected
actually.
going in. That's what I expected going in, and that's what it was. And it was really the time travel was kind of a setup for philosophical musing. Lots of conversations between the main character and Sigmund Freud.
Okay.
Yep. So
the author
it was
working out
interesting.
his.
It was interesting. It was pretty well done.
The author working out his own psychology, or something like.
You bet. You bet.
Hmm.
So if you're interested in Vienna of 1897, I would recommend it.
Okay. Sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
I did put up a review, very late review, but positive. It was hard to write about it, actually. It probably shows up in the review. When it's something like you really enjoy and you don't want to give away too many spoilers, it's much easier to write about a negative piece. But I put up a review of The Accidental Time Machine, which I had finished, I guess, a month ago, or maybe longer. And I had the review in there for quite a while, but I kept working on it for a while. So, But yeah, really, really good book.
Oh, good. So what is The Accidental Time Machine?
Oh, it's a Joe Haldeman novel.
Yeah, but
a
even
recent one.
in the book, what is it?
Oh,
What is
an MIT graduate student is working on some sort of regular atomic measuring device, I think. It's set like 50 years in the future. The very first part is set 50 years in the future, so. And he's working on something that would probably be very expensive now, but it's relatively inexpensive then. And he's making something that he's probably made before, but for some reason it doesn't work properly. And this atomic weight tester, calibrator basically, has a strange property. When he turns it on, it disappears. And it disappears for about 12 seconds. And he's going, huh? What the hell? Right? So he's like, have I been drinking too much coffee? What's going on here? And through a series of short experiments, he figures out that it's traveling into the future. And he figures out a way to take himself along with it. And that's the premise. But it only goes forward. It does not go backwards into the past.
Well, I see. That sounds good.
Yeah, it's really good. And
sounds interesting. I remember, it's not quite the same thing, but James P. Hogan wrote Thrice Upon A Time. That was one of the books I read as I was coming up, and it was about a messaging that you could go through time with messages. You couldn't send people back in time, but you could send messages. And then, of course, when the poop hits the fan, you want to send messages back to keep that poop from hitting the fan.
There's one actually pretty good science fiction movie that's kind of like that. Um, Jim Caviezel's in it. You know the one I mean?
Oh yeah, and yeah, Frequency.
Frequency. That's right.
Yeah, Dennis Quaid.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I'm kind of surprised that was a good movie, but
Mm-hmm.
I quite liked it.
Well, good.
It sort of used uh, it's one gimme well enough that it didn't make you upset with anything else.
Uh huh. Yeah. Hey, you know what I saw this week?
What's that?
The Clone Wars. Star
Hmm.
Wars: The Clone Wars, that animated movie.
Yeah, I saw it a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. Well, I didn't hate it. But part of it is, I know that part of it is because I want to like it so bad.
Oh.
I really like the Star Wars universe, and Episode 1 was a huge disappointment. And
Hmm.
then I felt like 2 was better and 3 was slightly better. But what's interesting is the audiobooks of all 3 of those
Hmm.
really make the movies so much better. Especially Episode 3, the unabridged audiobook of Episode 3, because the novelist who wrote that um, really approached that novel in a different way. And
Then the
so what
director,
you
you mean?
have, yeah, exactly. Especially with dialogue. Dialogue was a big problem.
Yeah, he's
So
pretty
if
clunky.
you listen to these audiobooks and you've got George Lucas's images in your head and the a good writer's words in your mind too, and it's really great.
Well, yeah,
So I highly recommend that.
you have to forgive George Lucas though, because I mean he is translating from a language that's long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, and
Yeah,
he's just doing his best to make that simple translation. And sure, it comes
right.
out sounding cheesy, you know.
You bet. You bet. So, but anyway, yeah, we watched it. My whole family went over to another family's house and we put it on their big old TV and watched it and had a great time.
Good.
And what more can you ask from a animated Star Wars movie?
Um, yeah, I don't think there was any nudity in it. I didn't like the talking. I didn't like the talking Jabba the Hutt
Uh-huh.
uh, uncle. I thought that was lame.
Mm-hmm.
The battle sequence took too long. Um, Other than that, it was okay. It was okay.
Yeah,
It
it was
wasn't. It
okay.
wasn't horrific.
Yeah,
And
I
there's a
didn't
new
hate it. It was
TV show,
probably,
right?
I had low expectations as well,
Yeah.
and that might have helped too. But I liked it. I didn't dislike it. Let me say that it's not my favorite movie ever, and yeah, it has flaws, but I didn't hate it.
I think part of the problem is they're working with the same material that they had, uh, I guess, with episode 3 or episode 2 or whatever. With the Clone
Yeah.
Wars, it's like, yeah, you have 700 guys on either side that look exactly the same. Where there's
Mhm.
man, the Roger robots and the
Uh-huh.
Kiwi clones or whatever. It's pretty simple.
Yeah. Yeah. No Jar Jar that I remember.
Yeah, you lucked out in the lack of there.
Hey, you know what else is cool if we're talking about movies? Have you watched the Star Trek trailer?
Yeah, you sent me a link to it.
Oh yeah. What did you think? I mean,
Um,
yeah.
yeah,
Hard to say.
I think you said something mildly positive, and I said something
Mildly
mildly
positive.
negative. I said they didn't screw it up too badly or something like that.
Yeah, I go back and
Oh,
forth on
what was
this.
that?
What was what?
Oh, I just heard a going offline noise.
Oh, um, no, I go back and forth on that movie. Um, you know, I'm much more a Star Trek fan than I am a Star Wars fan. Um,
Well, yeah,
so
dude, it's too far out. When it's coming,
yeah,
like, is
it's
it
too far out. But
springtime?
I'm just talking about the concept of the thing.
I don't.
You know, I get hot and cold. I think prequels. I don't know why prequels are so. Why do they want to do prequels? Why don't they move on?
Well, it's very clear
Um,
why they do prequels. It's because the actors are too old for sequels, and that's not going
well,
to
here
work.
they got a whole new set of actors.
That's right. So
Yeah.
they can't do I guess they could have done.
No, the problem with the prequel is nothing truly significant can possibly happen. Because if
Oh
they
yeah,
do that,
you can violate the rules of the previous movies.
yeah,
So
they could do that. And if
I
they do that,
see
that
at
would be a
least
bummer.
one of them in the trailer. Captain Kirk's driving a car in the very first sequence, right? Or motorcycle
Yeah.
or something. I can't remember.
There's a car. Yeah.
Okay. Don't we have this problem of he goes back in time in episode 4, and he says, "What's that?" He's like senile in episode 4 that he doesn't
That's
remember
right.
that he drove cars.
He's forgotten. Yeah, one of the things that had me, shaking my head is when I read that there were going to be scenes with, and this is a quote from the article, Kirk and Spock as children. And I was thinking, oh no, they're going to have these two, be buddies, when they were kids or something, and I was like, oh boy. But apparently that's not the case.
It's like little Archie.
Yeah, yeah. But apparently that's not the case. It looks like they follow Spock a little bit when he was young and follow Kirk when he was young.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. And I don't know. I don't know why they, obviously it's money. I mean, they think that this is going to be more popular, but they have all these other actors from the various series, especially Deep Space Nine and Voyager and Next Generation that they could do something with.
Well, I believe that it also has to do with what the guy who took it on wanted to do, right? J.J. Abrams didn't want to do a Voyager movie, and I don't blame him. I think Voyager had the weakest characters. I think Enterprise was not strong in characters. Deep Space Nine was pretty strong in characters, but also was not very popular compared to some of the other stuff, and it's been too long. Right? They had their chance.
Well, all true. Can't argue about that.
So, Mr. Ron, you're a podcaster, but
yes, I am.
I have a feeling that a lot of people have not heard of you, even though you've been around for a long time. How long have you been podcasting?
Since March of 2005.
That is
I guess you might call me a podcast pioneer of sorts.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think you're probably the first guy doing what you're doing. And what are you doing exactly?
I may be the only guy doing exactly what I'm doing. Essentially, what I do is I read hopefully humorous short stories and pieces from the public domain, which primarily means it's before 1923. My emphasis is on American writers or writers who were popular in America during that period. By and large, most of it was from what I call the golden age of American newspaper humor, which is from about the 1850s through the 1890s. But some of it goes as far as the 1920s.
Right. And I think I first stumbled across you. I think I found you before you found me. Is that true?
Okay, it's possible.
It doesn't sound familiar.
It is quite possible, although I guess the other side is true too. I certainly discovered SFFaudio, at least to look at, before we ever communicated.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've got the earliest contact I've got between us on the website is The Man Who Could Work Miracles, which was one of your...
the H.G. Wells story.
Right.
Yes.
For October 2005.
Okay.
And that was done for our H.G. Wells month.
Right. I remember now. Yes.
And I do believe that was the first MP3 version of that available on the internet.
I'm sure it was. I've always been a fan of that story. Of course, they made a wonderful movie out of it that Wells actually wrote the script for.
I haven't seen the movie, but I like the story.
Oh, yeah. Well, Wells actually wrote 2 movies. It was Things to Come
Mm-hmm.
and The Man Who Could Work Miracles. Things to Come was a big, huge hit at the box office. Miracles wasn't. But it was a great movie anyway.
Okay.
Okay, so anyway, going back to what I do, essentially, most of the authors, most people have never heard of, but at the time they were writing, they were household names in America. For example, M. Quad, whose real name was C.P. Lewis, everybody in the U.S. knew M. Quad. He was writing his weekly humor column, which was syndicated from about 1870 or so to his death in 1924.
Yeah,
And then it just fizzled away. Yeah. But from time to time, some of the humorous stories I find are related to science fiction, fantasy, or even crime fiction. I remember a while back I did a whole week of Sherlock Holmes spoofs.
Yeah, I'd love to have a post about that. So please remind me, and
All right, I'll try to pop up a post of that within the week.
that'd be great. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Sherlock Holmes and Sherlock Holmes spoofs, or at least imitation. There was I think it was August Derleth had his own imitation of Sherlock Holmes called Solar Pons. Have you read those? No?
No, I haven't, but I've heard of August Derleth.
Well, it was it was at the time when Sherlock Holmes was still under copyright, and I believe that when it was first started that Conan Doyle was still alive, and so
yeah,
he was saying, no, you can't do that, you can't write.
Well, a lot of people did it. O. Henry, I'm just looking here. O. Henry did The Adventures of Shamrock Jones.
Right.
Or Shamrock Jones. We had somebody wrote The Astounding Deductions of Picklock Holes, Thinlock Bones, Warlock Bones. So they got away with this stuff.
That's pretty funny. Yeah. And it becomes pretty easy to make fun of if you've got a series, and I think that should be pretty fun itself. The way I would describe what you're sort of doing to a Canadian, I would probably say you're writing. You're digging up people like what would be our Stephen Leacock. You know who Stephen Leacock is? I think you've probably done the Stephen Leacock story.
I actually have an entire page full of links, to 29 Stephen Leacock stories I've done. And in fact, I'm really proud of this. The official Stephen Leacock Medal of Humor webpage just put a whole front page article about Mr. Ron's Basement on their website. So cool. I'm very thrilled about that.
Yeah, Stephen Leacock's still a pretty big deal in Canada.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
and I think it's because his writing really holds up. Would you say Mark Twain is the American Stephen Leacock?
That's one way to put it.
I mean, obviously most people would put it the other way around, but...
Yeah, Leacock was actually a big Mark Twain fan. He wrote a book about Twain. And even though he was popular before, his popularity really took off right after Twain died in America, which is kind of fascinating. Kind of filled his shoes. Of course, Leacock's supreme effort was Sunshine Sketches of a Small Town. A novel about the fictional or semi-fictional town of Mariposa, which is so Canadian and so much fun. I would love to do it, but it would take me maybe a year to read it. Maybe when I'm finished with Connecticut Yankee, that'll be the next novel I serialize.
That'd be great. I'd be happy to have that serialized next. Once a week, recording one chapter, half a chapter at a time. Is that your schedule?
Right. If I did Sunshine sketches, it may take me 2 or 3 weeks to do a chapter. It's not many chapters and they're very long.
Okay.
But I'll keep one in mind. The very, very first Mr. Ron's Basement episode was a Leacock story. In fact, it was called The Irreducible Detective. And while it didn't really mention Sherlock Holmes or use a funny Holmes name, it was a Sherlock Holmes spoof for sure.
Well, it could have been a Poe spoof with that title. Poe was a real inventor of the
Oh, sure.
the locked room mystery with a detective, private detective that they could very well fit together like that.
Yes.
Poe also wrote for newspapers. Is that
basically, newspaper humor kind of began in the 1830s with the invention of the motorized or steam-driven newspaper press, which enabled people to come out with penny newspapers. And a man in Maine, name of Seba Smith, created the first humorous character that would appear week after week, a series of phony letters from this character named Major Jack Downing appeared in the newspaper, and circulation caught on like crazy. And after that, more and more newspapers found that they could pick up readers by putting humor in.
Yeah, and I think the literacy of newspapers, the fiction of newspapers has got a long tradition. Even before that, Benjamin Franklin was a big writing letters to his own newspaper sort of guy.
Yeah. In fact, for when Ben Franklin's 300th birthday came around, I did a week of Franklin stories. Some of them were quite rude.
Yes.
He did one story, which I read with as judiciously as possible, a story that he did about farting.
Well, there's a humor for you.
Yep.
From one of the founding farting fathers.
Yes, but by and large, humor in newspapers was incidental. Essentially, before the steam press, newspapers were sold by annual subscription, and they were $20, $30 a year, which back in the late 1700s and early 1800s was an enormous amount. That'd be like thousands of dollars in today's money to subscribe to newspapers. So they weren't really aiming for the popular audience. But the steam press and the penny newspaper, all of a sudden, they had to come up with circulation building stunts because they wanted people out in the street to buy a newspaper, not just subscribe to it at home. Also, in most American homes, at least, right up through the early 20th century, most newspaper and magazine readers in homes were women because most men were illiterate. And a man would come home in the evening from work and his wife would read him pieces from the newspaper. See what's going on.
The original audiobook.
Yes, and in fact, one of the most popular humorous writers of the 19th century was Fanny Fern, who from the 1850s up to her death in 1872 was immensely popular. She was the highest paid columnist in America. Her work was syndicated all over, and she was a bit controversial. A lot of people wouldn't allow Fanny Fern's stories in a respectable home, which is kind of fascinating. But she was very much involved with early women's rights movement and was a founder of a group called Sorosis in New York City, which was for women journalists. They formed the organization when Charles Dickens came to New York, and he wanted to speak to a journalist club, and they wouldn't allow women, even working women journalists, to come to this meeting and meet Charles Dickens. So that's when they formed their own organization, and they asked Fanny Fern to head it. And up till then, she hadn't really been involved with any organizations, but she threw herself into it. But her stories are, they run the gamut. A lot of them are just sentimental stuff that's so sickly sweet you can't really look at it without an insulin shot. But a lot of her stuff, especially regarding husbands and wives and children and odd things when you travel and stuff like that, were very funny. And I try to read as many Fanny Fern stories as I can put in. I've got an index of them up on the webpage as well.
Well, let's give your website. It's a little bit. It's probably easier just to type in Mr. Ron into Google. Will that bring up a Mr. Ron website?
Yeah, it helps if you spell out the word Mr., but if you type Mr. Ron, you'll get there.
Okay.
Yeah, there are, Mr. Ron's Basement is all over the place. Of course, you can subscribe to it in iTunes. Mm-hmm. It's free. And now the way the iTunes works, their menu will show the most recent 300, but if you hit the subscribe button, all episodes become available to you. And unless you have a whole heck of a lot of hard drive space, you may not want to click on the Get All Episodes button.
And bandwidth, too. If you're living in Iqaluit and you hit the subscribe to all, I think your bandwidth would suddenly go to zero.
Right. At the moment, I have 1,218 episodes. I update it every single day, 7 days a week.
Have you missed any days?
Yeah, but I make up for them, usually. Although there was a period earlier this year where my server was having some technical difficulties. They were switching their server, and I went for about a month or so without updating. And it was extremely frustrating to me because reading these things every night is kind of like a shot in the arm for me. Mm-hmm. It's I've gotten addicted to reading stories.
Well, you've actually got a pretty good voice for it too, and I think there's been some evolution in your delivery.
Oh, thank you very much. My son says I have a great face for radio.
That's probably the opposite of what you could say for television, right?
Yeah. Television's fun, but we only have one video on the entire Mr. Ron's.
You got a video podcast?
There's one video up there. I didn't number it, but if you hunt around on the webpage, you can find it. My friend, cartoonist Bud Grace, who does the Piranha Club daily strip, did a little birthday greeting video for Mr. Ron's Basement a couple years ago, and it's still up there, and it's fun to look at. Okay. And it has the secret of Mr. Ron's mustache in it.
Yes. You don't have a lot of graphics on your website, but you do have the Mr. Ron character, and he does look very dapper in his
yeah, that's based on a drawing of me that was done by Jack Davis, one of the greatest cartoonists of history. He goes back to the old EC Comics days. He's done probably more TV Guide covers than anybody else, and Time magazine covers and so on. He's kind of a friend of mine. Long time ago, back when the internet was just sort of catching on, I guess 96 or so, I created the first website for the National Cartoonist Society, and in gratitude, they actually made me a full-fledged member. which is weird. Sometimes I go to meetings and everyone sits around and saying, how do we keep non-cartoonists away from our meetings? And I just sort of sit there and blush.
Like there's a lot of people clamoring at the door trying to get in, is that?
Oh, well, yeah, it's a very exclusive organization. It's for professional cartoonists and illustrators. It was founded by Rube Goldberg back in the 1940s. In fact, there's a legend that Rube Goldberg, back around 1909 or so, tried to start a national cartoonist organization, and he went to a meeting with Mark Twain. There's no proof of this, but it's one of those legends that people who knew Rube claim that he told them. So who knows?
Interesting. Your
yeah.
font of information about that, just what's going on in the news 100 years ago. It's addictive. One of my uncles is addicted to collecting newspapers from ancient times, and he's always telling me news, what's going on in the newspaper back 150 years ago. And one of the things he thinks that you can find is that you can find a lot of sort of information that we knew but don't know anymore. So
sure.
He's more into the nonfiction end of newspapers, but one of the things he has is an account of a balloon rescue in Paris during the French Revolution, when the city was under a revolution. I believe it was some Scarlet Pimpernel-esque characters, got into a balloon and took off out of the city so that they could avoid the raging crowds. And this is reported in the London Daily News or whatever it was. It's I don't have a copy of the paper in front of me, and I was told a couple of years ago. But I keep telling him he should, put these up on the internet, scan them up, put that article up. That's a perfect blog entry. I'm just so fascinated by real life things that are tied in, and that's what the newspaper is. It's history every day.
Oh, for sure. A lot of the stories that I do are related to the news of the day.
Right.
A lot of times they spoof those things. When necessary, I will try to explain it. Although sometimes, for example, this Stanley Huntley's Swoopendike stories frequently made fun of the goings-on in the Guiteau trial. Mm-hmm. Now, Charles Guiteau was, of course, the man who assassinated President Garfield. And they certainly got into that, and I don't really go into too much detail when I read stories that mention that, because it's kind of incidental to know that. Although sometimes there are things where I have to actually back up and really explain.
You need the context. You absolutely
context,
need the context.
Yeah.
And for example, the most recent story got posted, A Journey to the Sun. Without the context of the what it's spoofing, I don't think anybody's going to understand why it's funny.
Right. Although enough people read Jules Verne that and of course a lot of people have seen Around the World in 80 Days, the movie, mm-hmm. and so they would be familiar with the name Phineas Fogg, for instance.
Right.
And they would get the joke about spoofing his name.
Mm-hmm. But it's also not just spoofing, character names and stuff like that. It's also, it's like when that book came out at the time. This is being the newspaper not too long after. Is that correct?
Well, actually, this Around the World in 80 Days was from 1872, and the spoof was from 1880.
But the 1872 is the English edition?
That's a good question. I don't know. It may have been much later. Now, the other
probably
one
a reprinting
I did,
or something, if not. It's like we get Robot Chicken for, Star Wars. We're getting spoofs of what we know. For them, they're getting spoofs of what they know.
Yeah.
Right?
But,
Have you got a lot of H.G. Wells spoofs, or is it more of Jules Verne and Mark Twain and?
Well, Wells didn't write a whole heck of a lot of humor. That's the problem. I would love to read more Wells, but
I'm actually thinking spoofs of his stuff rather than
spoofs of his stuff. Yeah. I haven't seen much of that.
Like The Visible Man or something like that.
That would be interesting. I may look into it and see what I can find.
And you're basically working with American newspapers, is that correct?
Basically, of course, Leacock is the big, exception,
sure.
And occasionally there are other people as well, but primarily, for instance, if somebody foreign was popular in America, then I got no problem.
Right.
And occasionally it's the other way around. W.L. Alden wrote for the New York Times for years, but he wrote a lot of his great humor while he was in England.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll still write that, include that stuff. Going back to the idea that we were just talking about pulling up things out of context.
Mm-hmm.
I was just looking on the page here, and way back in 1868, I found a story by Brick Pomeroy that used the word womblecropped. Actually, in fact, no, it wasn't by him. Now that I think about it. Let me see here. No, it was womblecropped. And I actually asked readers on the webpage and in the episode, anybody know what a womblecropped is? And I finally found out it's a word that means a rumbling stomach. And apparently it was very common. And, sometimes you just have to guess.
That's passed out of the dictionary, I think, yeah.
Yeah, after somebody told me about it, I looked it up in an unabridged dictionary, and I found it and had the word archaic next to it. So occasionally you do run into things that you just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But there's just so much stuff. I think that the lives of the American humorists kind of intertwined in a lot of ways because a lot of them did work for newspapers. Mark Twain, many years, tried to pretend he never wrote for newspapers. In fact, when he did write for newspapers, he often used other pen names because he was a little embarrassed by it. And
it's like writing science fiction today. People, oh no, I don't write science fiction. I write my books.
Indeed, yeah, it's very similar. And that's just, the way things were. It was considered very low class to be a newspaper humorist, even though people who wrote it were immensely popular.
Right.
But back then there was a huge difference between being popular and being proper. One of the things that people did not like about Fanny Fern was that she wrote in vernacular. She did not bother trying to be proper. She wrote like she conversed.
Right.
And that was pretty radical in the 1850s. Nowadays...
The original Ebonics or something like that.
Well, not even... Well, to a point, but just like the way everybody talked. There was a huge difference between formal speech and writing and informal speech and writing. When you read Shakespeare... I know a lot of people think, well, that's how people talk.
I don't think so.
And no, people did not talk like Shakespeare in Shakespeare's day. People who were highly educated talked to each other that way,
would
perhaps
try.
in formal
would
situations.
Try.
Yeah, they would try. But there, as I say, there are many, many stories about these people. And they do intertwine a lot. One, 1 there's, for instance, between Fanny Fern and Philander Doesticks. Neither of those, of course, were their real names. Fanny Fern was Sarah Willis Peyton Parton, and Philander Doesticks was Mortimer Thomson. Their stories very much intertwined. They were both very popular. They lived in New York, actually in Brooklyn, during the 1850s and 60s. And Thomson, Doesticks, married Fern's daughter. And they had a child. She died a few months later. And it was kind of sad, the story of Doesticks. He was top of the world, very funny guy. He hung out with a group of bohemians in New York City at a place called Pfaff's Beer Cellar. And that group included people like Walt Whitman and other famous writers of the day, and they would go and do wild and crazy things. There's a webpage devoted to Pfaff's Beer Cellar. It's Pfaff''S, and if you Google that, you can find out some fascinating stories about these early beatniks from the 1850s. And
it's like the Algonquin Round Table from
very
earlier.
much. Only they were a little wilder. When the Prince of England came to New York for a visit, Thomson and a few other members of the set went and essentially kidnapped him and took him out for a night of wild carousing in the city. And all the prince's people were really upset because they didn't know where he was. So, they were involved in pretty wild stuff. But Thomson, even though he was very famous for his humorous writing, today he's more well known for going down south to the largest slave auction in history, pretending to be a slave buyer. And on the train back to New York, he wrote an article about the horrible situation of slaves at auction. He called it the crying time. And the newspaper it appeared in New York had to create a second edition. It was very popular. An anti-slavery group printed it up as a flyer and distributed it all over America. And it probably helped elect Abe Lincoln. Created that much anti-slavery feeling. Up till then, the common word was, "Oh, they're happy. We take care of them." And he just kind of shattered those illusions. The story itself isn't very funny, but he still wrote it using his Philander Doesticks pen name, which up till then was associated with incredibly funny stories. But after that, he kind of had double tragedies. He was married to two beautiful young girls who, one died in childbirth, and the other, Fanny Fern's daughter, died a few months later when his first son was visiting, and he gave her scarlet fever.
Oh, God.
And so he lost both of his wives, pretty much in a row. He went to cover the Civil War as a reporter, and he pretended to be a chaplain. And the New York 26th Regiment, I was reading about this in some book, somebody wrote the reminiscences of the Civil War in 1906, and they had a little piece in it about when they were handing out drinks to the workers, to the soldiers who were building a hospital. They insisted that their friend, the chaplain Doesticks, get his drink. But during the war, he actually took a bullet for a popular officer that everyone loved, and it shattered ribs. And they never could heal right, and he became a morphine addict, which was not that uncommon back then. You could buy this stuff over the counter.
Sure.
If you went to a doctor and said you had a headache, he'd just say, "Go buy some morphine."
Yeah, and all the drinks were doped with it. Like a lot of products you could buy. That'd be the major ingredient.
Yeah, it could have been.
Beetroot and morphine.
Yes, but he got addicted to morphine. He tried after the Civil War to continue writing humor, and I've even read some examples of his post-Civil War humor, and it's pitiful. It gets worse and worse, and he finally fell into total poverty. He was forgotten, and when he died in 1875, hardly anybody noticed. There were a few little notices in some newspapers, and it was more like, yeah, the guy who used to be Dough Sticks is gone. But when he first started writing, he actually had produced a hoax saying that he was dead, and newspapers plastered it from coast to coast in big articles.
Oh, that's quite a. He's wrote his fake, his own fake epitaph, and it ends up being popular when he's still alive, but when he's actually dead, nobody cares.
Yeah. What's interesting is his daughter, when his second wife died a few months after giving birth, his Fanny Fern and her husband James Parton, who back then was a famous biographer, adopted the little girl. And in fact, I looked at I have the complete New Yorker on DVD, and I found an article that his daughter wrote in 1930s about growing up with Fanny Fern, and it's fascinating. But she was raised by James Parton. When Fanny Fern died in 1872, he moved her and Fanny's other daughter, the older daughter, to Newburyport, Massachusetts. And years later, he married Fanny's older daughter. And they found out a couple days later that in Massachusetts, it was illegal to marry your stepdaughter, even if you weren't related by blood. So they went and got married in New York again. And then Parton had enough influence in Massachusetts that he convinced the legislature to pass a law making it legal to marry an adopted relative who wasn't blood related. But the governor vetoed it because he said he didn't want to tamper with marriage laws. And, you know, sometimes things stay the same in the newspaper headlines from, 150 years ago to today,
It's true.
So it's kind of fascinating. But she eventually, her name was Ethel Thompson, and she eventually changed her name to Ethel Parton. And when she turned 21, and in the 1930s and 40s, she became a very famous children's book author, writing these wonderful books about growing up in Newburyport, Massachusetts, in the 1800s, and they took place in different decades. And in a lot of ways, they're probably predecessors to the popular American Girl series, which kids gobble up like candy these days. So there's kind of just all this complicated tie-in. Parton herself didn't like what had become of her real father. She had written about it, and she felt that he had no excuse to become a morphine addict and all that, because that's just the climate of things.
Sure.
But anyway, like I say, the stories all get intertwined with each other. I firmly believe that Mortimer Thomson, Dough Sticks, was highly influential on Stanley Huntley, because they both lived and worked in Brooklyn at the same time, although Huntley's career as a humorist didn't take off until the 1880s.
I gotta ask you about so it's kind of interesting because I think newspapers are kind of like podcasts in that they're basically very ephemeral. They're not designed to stick around for a long time, and yet what you've done is you've done what they didn't really intend, which is to go back and look at a whole career rather than just a single column. You're interested in the progression and the whole story that's being told over all these years. What do you think the relationship between popular the popular people's consumption of entertainment and news and the relationship between that and podcasting? I think that's kind of striking. You're talking about this steam-powered printer. Now we've got WordPress and PodPress and I guess
Yeah, the paper newspaper may eventually evolve out or become a very small item.
Well, I'm not thinking so much about
this.
definitely newspapers are dying in the traditional sense. They're firing all their their news gatherers and consolidating and that sort of thing. I'm more actually thinking about what you think about podcasting in relationship to the heyday of newspapers.
Yeah, well, podcasting is right now, it's still pretty early in the game. And it's sort of like they said back in the late 1920s and early 1930s, if you could stand in front of a microphone without being scared to death, you had a career in radio ahead of you.
Yeah.
And there are huge amounts of podcasts out there, and they are ephemeral. In most cases, old ones vanish.
And they're gone forever.
Yeah, I mean, there is the work by places like archive.org, which tries to get a snapshot of everything, but when it comes to that,
audio.
Yeah, not the audio. Although they do store some audio. Although Roger Strickland, who runs Slapcast, which is my server, did look into the possibility of getting archive.org to back up my podcast, but they really weren't too thrilled about it because of the huge amount of it.
Well, archive.org does accept public domain stuff. If you're willing to put your stuff in the public domain, you can put your stuff there.
Yeah, now that gets tricky. I haven't really considered whether or not. I know I'm reading public domain stories, and
it's copyrighted.
The question here is,
recorded though.
Is my performance copyrighted?
Yes,
and I haven't really decided.
As long as you say it is.
Well,
if you don't want it to be,
I think I may go with a Creative Commons type approach that, as far as I'm concerned, my performances are out there. Anybody can duplicate them. If somebody was to press them and sell them on eBay like people do with LibriVox recordings, I might get offended if I didn't get a cut.
They're not making very much. I wouldn't worry too much about it.
Well, actually, there are people who apparently just crank out pressings of LibriVox recordings and sell them on eBay all the time, and it must be worth their while, or they wouldn't keep paying the placement fees.
Yeah, they're definitely making something, but
and another.
I don't think there's a lot of money to go around. They don't sell for very much. They're selling for $10 at most, right? And after you take into account all the costs involved, postage and CDs and all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, I've thought about the idea of going into doing audiobooks. I've actually made available CDs of the best of Mr. Ron's Basement, which I even stopped putting links to the listings because nobody ever bought them. I hand them out to people as promotions sometimes. But the problem is why buy a CD of something you can download for free?
I agree completely, but on the other hand, people do want CD versions, and that's why they show up on eBay.
Oh yeah.
But I think if you were saying, here's a collection of H.G. Wells rather than Mr. Ron doesn't have the cachet of.
You're right. I mean, I probably could package them like that. I've noticed, I have, of course, standing searches on eBay for a lot of my authors.
Right.
And oddly enough, some of the most forgotten of authors, there are companies that do print on demand, and they sell new versions of Max Adler stories and Dostick stories and so on of their books. And I see the listings all the time, and they say new, the letters of Philander Doesticks, and there it is. And they want 20 or 30 bucks for it, and it's a new printing. So I'm assuming they do print on demand, so they don't have to have a stock of books sitting there. And
yeah,
you may see more and more of this eventually. So we'll see. But, talking about the ephemeralness of newspapers, that's kind of what I'm doing, is I'm using the power of the internet to dig into these old newspapers and so on, and pull them out and try to repopularize some of this stuff.
It basically would have been impossible before the internet for you to have gathered as much as you've got.
Yeah, even if I knew where these authors' writings were, I would have had to have flown from city to city to look in dusty volumes and so on. When I did episode 1000, the 3-hour-long, 3-part Stanley Huntley story documentary, I actually did go down to the Library of Congress, and I went through the entire year's worth of Bismarck, Dakota Tribune that he edited. A wild newspaper, absolutely wild. And it's not available on the internet, unfortunately, and I had to go and lug my butt down to the Library of Congress to find it.
And they allowed you to do some scans, I assume.
Well, not scans, but I could bring a camera and shoot it without a flash.
Oh, yeah, that'll work.
And it sort of worked. I couldn't do the whole thing, not a year's worth of newspapers, so I picked selected articles.
Sure.
But it's a long, slow, and kind of aggravating way to get stuff like this. It's much nicer to go to, say, like the Brooklyn Daily Eagle's website and pull up the whole run in PDF
Brooklyn
format.
Daily Eagle still in operation?
They are in operation. There was a period where they were gone, but they've been back for years now. What this is the public library in Brooklyn had, I guess they took microfilm that they had of the old Eagle and translated it into web pages.
Yeah, microfiche. Hey.
Yeah, and now it is searchable, but the search is not great. If you look up Spoopendike, you'll find about half the Spoopendike stories that are in the Eagle. The only way to really search it is to sit there and click on issue after issue and flip through them on your computer. Which is why, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, after I thought all the Spoopendike stories by Stanley Huntley were gone, I found one. I've done about, a little over 90 of them, and I think that's pretty much his entire output. What's interesting is some of them I found in New Zealand papers from the 1880s on the internet. And, that saved me a trip to New Zealand where I wouldn't have even suspected that those things were.
Right.
So it is interesting that, and this is the days when to get something to New Zealand, you had to stick a newspaper on a boat because they didn't have a telegraphic cable across the Pacific back then.
No, they wouldn't.
So it's kind of interesting, though, that apparently the Spoopendikes were very popular in New Zealand, and newspaper down there ran their stories regularly as soon as they get their hands on them. And what's real interesting is I actually did one episode where I showed that they actually censored them a bit. Mr. Spoopendike would frequently say, "Dod gast it." And that was too much for them. They left those out. They thought that was a little too much for their readers.
Conservative lot down there.
Yeah, very conservative. But it's just fascinating. Anyway, but this ephemeralness, if you carry it to today, right now, you say Art Buchwald, and people remember Art Buchwald, even though he died a little while ago. But there's still plenty of people who used to read him all the time. 100 years from now, you say Art Buchwald, and people say, huh? And they say, oh, yeah, he was a popular writer of satire, of political things back in the, 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And, unless somebody stumbles over one of his old books, they're liable not to know who he was. It's probably a very esoteric thing to be, even 100 years from now, for people to be looking at, say, 20th century Washington Posts and digging up humor columns via, Mr. Somebody else's basement 100 years from now doing that sort of thing.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap this up.
Yeah, I do too. I appreciate you taking time to chat with me.
Oh, my pleasure, Mr. Ron.
And I wish you lots of luck with SFFaudio. I think it's one of the coolest sites out there.
Thank you very much.
And
I think we're doing sort of similar things. We've got our passions, and we're interested in them, and damn the torpedoes if nobody else cares.
Sounds good. Okay, well, thank you very much. Oh, and I don't know if you want to include this. I'd like to put a plug in for my server, slapcast.com.
Okay.
They give you unlimited bandwidth for $5 a month. And a site like mine, we use sometimes hundreds of gigabytes a day of bandwidth. So I'm getting my money's worth. If you think you're going to do a podcast that's going to be that popular with thousands of downloads, it's a bargain.
There's a seventh dimension show, Doctor Who, the Zygon Who Fell to Earth, new on BBC 7, airing on this weekend. It should be available on the iPlayer after. The Time Lord and his trusty companion, Lucy Miller, return in another time travel drama. In this episode, there's a family reunion between Lucy and her favorite Aunt Pat. But who exactly is Uncle Trevor, and and is he quite what he appears to be? Starring Paul McGann, one of the earlier doctors. And they've also got the rebroadcasting Duel from BBC 7's 2006 broadcast. That's the Richard Matheson story. Remember that one? Got turned into a movie?
Oh, yeah.
So those are out there. They've also got C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet, starting weekdays in the coming week. I haven't read either any of that trilogy science fiction thriller series by C.S. Lewis. Have you?
No, I haven't.
I've only read the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe series, not the Out of the Silent Planet series.
Yeah, the same for me.
Okay.
This has been the SFF Audio Podcast. Please join us at www.sffaudio.com.